Thanks for joining us tonight to celebrate Jane Austen's 250th birthday. I'm Lorraine Maffa, Programming Coordinator at Loudoun County Public Library, and it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker. Rita Baker-Schmidt is a lifetime member of the Jane Austen Society of North America. She is the former regional coordinator for the Maryland region and is a member of the annual General Meeting Planning Committee for 2025. This year, the AGM will be in Maryland on October 10th through 12th, and Rita said, you don't want to miss out. She is also the chair of the Jane Austen Day at Manor Mill in Moncton, Maryland, and next year the group will celebrate all things Pride and Prejudice. Welcome, Rita.
Hi, thanks for having me. We're going to get started right now, if that's okay with you.
Yeah.
All right, so today we're going to talk about Jane Austen and gardens. By examining, let me get to that slide. There we go. By examining the gardens and landscapes in her letters and novels, we can discover more about Jane's life and about her characters. We're going to do that in 4 sections. We're going to examine the gardens in Jane Austen's life, the gardens on the page, flowers Austen loved, and then we're going to learn how we can create an Austenesque garden. Austen was born in Steventon, England in 1755, just before our own Revolutionary War began. It's here at Steventon that she wrote all of her early works, the first drafts of Sense and Sensibility, Pride and Prejudice, and Northanger Abbey. This is a quote from Deirdre LeFay. Mr. Austen's study was at the back of the house on a warm southern side, overlooking the walled garden with its sundial. And you can see Reverend Austen's study window right there. The illustration is by Jane's niece, Anna Lefroy. And in her book, Regency Gardens, Mavis Bate tells us that 18th century gardens, for the most part, were banished flowers to the walled kitchen gardens, and often they were grown like their vegetable counterparts in boxes. But by the time Jane frolicked at Steventon, the flowers were freed of their boxes and grew in bunches and were allowed to spread right up to the shrubbery. And the Austen's garden was a mixed-use garden, and it sported both flowers and vegetables. One way that they grew their vegetables and their fruit was espadrilled, like these espadrilled fruit trees that you see on the right. And that just meant that they grew them, they trained them to be flat against a wall or a garden fence, and that saved space. Here's another shot of Steventon. This is from the front. And James Edward Austen Lee, he is one of her famous relatives that wrote posthumously after Jane had passed away, the Memoir of Jane Austen, which is a pretty fruity version of Jane Austen's life. He made her sound quite angelic. And here we have on the south side, the ground rose gently and occupied one of those old-fashioned gardens in which vegetables and flowers were combined. And which flowers did we have? Primroses, anemones, and wild hyacinths. But there were also vegetables, and Jane often wrote letters to Cassandra about the improvements to the garden. Jane's mother, Mrs. Austen, was quite the gardener, and her garden provided the fruit, the vegetable, and the herbs for the family. She was one of the first people in the area to adopt growing potatoes. They had eggs from the chickens. They had milk and cheese from the dairy cows. And one can imagine sitting down at the Austen supper table, bursting with family and students for a simple country meal with a big bowl of excellent boiled potatoes. They grew most of what they needed, and they only had to buy a few staples like tea, sugar, coffee, and chocolate. Jane really loved her time at Steventon, but Alas, all good things come to an end, and in 1801, her father decided to retire. He stopped being a reverend. Well, he retired from his job at Steventon, and that meant that they had to move, and they had to move to Bath. And if you're a Jane Austen fan, you know that Jane probably did not like Bath at all. She didn't like leaving her beautiful Steventon to go to the noisy, dirty city. Um, Most lodgings in Bath, if they had a townhome, much like a Baltimore City row home, had a small plot in the back, like a small backyard that was mostly laid to lawn. And here at for Sydney Place, they had a small backyard that was just had enough for a gravel path and a little bit of shrubbery. So Jane just begged her father to have a place that was near a public square or a public park. Reverend Austen wanted to live at Laurel Place because he had relatives there. Mrs. Austen wanted to live at Queen Square because she had relatives there. And Jane and Cassandra wanted to live at Sydney Place because it had this beautiful green space next to it, the Sydney Gardens. It would be very pleasant to be near Sydney Gardens. We might go to the labyrinth every day. This was a letter. You're going to see a lot of letters from Jane to Cassandra. And in fact, Sydney Place was right across from Sydney Gardens. And the girls convinced mom and dad to move into Sydney Place. And they had a very lovely garden-esque lifestyle. Sydney Gardens, with its well-maintained flower beds and gravel paths and labyrinth, also appealed to the Austens for its concerts, illuminations, and fireworks. To give you an idea of how close their house was to the garden, here is a modern day Google slide. And if you follow the blue line, here's Sydney Place, and she just had to walk down the street to the garden gate, which was here, and go into the gardens. Alas, the labyrinth no longer exists, but you can see that the park is still there. After Mr. Austen died, Mrs. Austen and Jane and Cassandra were on their own trying to find a place to live to really settle down. They were joined by their friend Martha Lloyd, and Jane and Cassandra's brother Frank offered to have them stay with his family in Southampton. So Jane, Cassandra, Mrs. Austen, and Martha Lloyd all moved in with Frank's family in Southampton. It was a good mutual agreement because he was often at sea and wanted company for his young wife, because she was pregnant with their first child and they needed a place to stay. The maritime influence of Southampton might have introduced her to coastal blooms, and her observations could have included the intertwining scents of sea air and garden blossoms like lilac, laburnum, and roses. And you can see another quote from Jane to Cassandra here. We hear that we are envied our house by many people and that the garden is the best in town. And here's another letter from Jane to Cassandra. Our garden is putting in order by a man who bears a remarkably good character. He has a very fine complexion and asks something less than the first. The shrubs which border our gravel walk, he says, are only sweetbriar and roses. So not only does it show some of Jane's humor, but also some of her frugality. They were happy to have their own garden once again, and they planted fruits and flowers and vegetables and shrubs. Here's a contemporary drawing of Southampton. They settled at 3 Castle Square, and they had garden views. Some of the garden views were the best in the best part of the house. Again, we have James Edward Austen Lee, giving us a quote that says that the house had a pleasant garden bounded on one side by the old city wall, and on top of this wall was sufficiently wide enough to afford a pleasant walk, with an extensive view easily accessible to the ladies by steps. And this puts me in mind of the novel Persuasion, one of her last novels, where the group goes to Lyme and walks along the Cobb. Austen drew heavily on her naval brothers, Frank and Charles, to flesh out characters like Captains Wentworth, Bennett, and Harville. Surely her time in this waterfront town, and with its pleasant garden and its elevated walk overlooking the water and access by stairs, influenced her thoughts on that very particular chapter in Persuasion where they walk along the Cobb and there's an accident, and that makes a good plot device for Jane Austen. Finally, the Austen ladies found a permanent home at Chawton Cottage. Jane wrote or revised all 6 of her novels at Chawton. The garden here was separated by a busy Winchester road by a thick hedgerow. And I have another quote for Jane to Cassandra in 1811, shortly after, well, a couple of years after they moved there. The whole of the shrubbery border will soon be very gay with pinks and sweet williams, in addition to the columbines that are already in bloom. The syringes, too, are coming out. You can't imagine. It is not in human nature to imagine what a nice walk we have around the orchard. All of these images from Chawton came from Chawton House, and I really appreciate that they were very kind to send these to me. Jane's brother Edward gave Mrs. Austen, Cassandra, Jane, and their friend Martha Lloyd a cottage at Chawton, set in several acres of pleasant grounds and orchards. The house was a well-built, roomy 6-bedroom house, and it had numerous outbuildings and a good kitchen garden. Her sister Cassandra kept bees in the garden and supplied the household with honey. And beyond the kitchen gardens, they also grew a dye garden whose flowers, roots, and leaves were harvested to dye fabric. And you see some lavender in the foreground there. At nearly 70, Mrs. Austen still loved working in the garden. She enjoyed toiling away with both the pretty flowers in the kitchen garden and digging up those excellent potatoes. Mrs. Austen, we know from several contemporaneous quotes, wore a ubiquitous green frock whenever she gardened, a green round frock. And if anyone out there has a pattern for a green round frock, I do hope you will send it to me, because I would love to add that to my gown collection. And here we have another quote from Jane to Cassandra. Our young peony at the foot of the fir tree has just blown and looks very handsome, and the whole of the shrubbery bower will soon be very gay with pinks and sweet william, in addition to columbines already in bloom. The syringes, too, are coming out. Syringes are the same thing as sweet orange, no, mock orange. You can see some of Austen's interesting spelling choices in this quote. So after even during Chawton, she would often go to London to visit her brothers. She visited there many times, and she really liked to stay with her one brother, Henry. Henry seemed to be a very fun-loving brother. And he lived, one of the places he lived was 23 Hands Place. One of the reasons she loved this particular house was because it had access to a garden square, which is one of those gardens where all the houses surround the garden and only the people that live in those houses can get into the garden. She had a room downstairs that overlooked the garden, and she describes her routine of working indoors and having a break by going outside. I go and refresh myself every now and then and come back to solitary coolness. So if you want to get your inner Austen on, you can go to London and go to 23 Hands Place, and you can stay in the same room that she stayed in for just $550 a night. You can enjoy the same view that Jane Austen had, sort of, because now it's a dining room. This is 23 Hands Place, and it's now an apartment boutique hotel, just $550 a night. So let's talk about gardening on the page. We're going to look inside all the novels. And here is an early Brock illustration. This one's from Emma. And we find Mr. Knightley and Emma in a private moment as he proposes. And all I can say to Emma is, say yes. Everyone seems to fall in love outside, walking in a garden or under the trees in a park. Most of the happy proposals take place in the outdoors. Here's another Brock illustration. This one's a later edition. And again, we have Emma. This time she's in full matchmaking mode. And I believe that's Harriet and Mr. Elton. And to Harriet, I say no. Within Jane's fictional gardens, she provides heroines space to evade their families, talk privately with friends, and stage secret rendezvous. So we're just going to go through all 6 of the big novels. Sense and Sensibility. Here's a quote from Sense and Sensibility. It's Marianne. Barton Cottage was a big step down from Norland Park. As a cottage, it failed to fit Marianne's romantic notion of what a cottage ought to be because there's no honeysuckle. Marianne's fateful walk at Cleveland begins at a garden near the house. It's fairly calm there. She's not in too much trouble, but it gets very dangerous, even life-threatening, as she goes off the garden path and into the wilds of the park, and she gets very sick. So it's important that you stay in the garden, on the path. That's sort of a theme with Austen. In Pride and Prejudice, we have lovers like Jane and Bingley as they walk alone in the shrubbery. We have Mr. Collins with his garden at Hunsford. And who could forget the palatial grounds of Pemberley or walking the paths at Rosings? Even humble Longbourn has its prettyish little wilderness in the garden. I'm sticking with Pride and Prejudice for a minute. This is another Brock illustration. And here we see Elizabeth, and then we've got Mrs. Bingley, Mrs. Hurst, and Mr. Darcy. I'm going to read it. This is from chapter 10, and it really shows Austen's knowledge of gardening and landscape. And I'm going to read you a passage from it. I did not know you intended to walk, said Mrs. Bingley, with some confusion, lest they be overheard. You used us abominably ill, answered Mrs. Hurst, running away without telling us that you were coming out. Then, taking the disengaged arm of Mr. Darcy, she left Elizabeth to walk by herself. The path just admitted 3. Mr. Darcy felt their rudeness and immediately said, This walk is not wide enough for our party. We had better go by the avenue. But Elizabeth, who had not the least inclination to remain with them, laughingly answered, No, stay where you are. You are charmingly grouped and appear to uncommon advantage. The picturesque would be spoiled by admitting a 4th. Goodbye. And she ran gaily off, rejoicing, as she rambled about in the hope of being home again in a day or 2. And here she reveals that both Elizabeth and Jane Austen have read the renowned landscape gardener William Gilpin's observations on Cumberland and Westmoreland that recommends that landscape portraits limit the amount of livestock in a painting. 2 cows is sufficient. 3 cows are ideal, but more than 3 cows spoil the scene. Thus, Elizabeth leaves Darcy impressed that she is so widely read, and maybe a little surprised that she has just called him a cow. And now we'll move on to Mansfield Park. This is a quote by Lady Bertram. She's talking about how she was out about an hour in the heat of the day to gather roses, but she really isn't out. She's in the shade while poor Fanny has to get the roses. I assure you, it was very hot. It was shady enough in the alcove, but I declare I quite dreaded coming home again. Fanny later finds contentment and solace in the outdoors. To sit in the shade on a fine day and look upon the verdure is the most perfect refreshment. chapter 9. And then in chapter 16, by giving air to her geraniums, she might inhale the breeze of mental strength itself. And now we're going to go on to Emma, 1815. And you might notice that it says 1815, but sometimes the publication dates on these are later because they're later publications. Characters in Emma often go into the garden to escape the confines of the house. Emma, who loves her father dearly, must feel the need to go on long outdoor walks to offset his omnipresent hypochondria. Austen also uses gardens as a metaphor of class in Emma, as we see big, brilliantly appointed gardens at Hartfield and Donwell, and compare them to the humble working gardens of Martin Farm. On to Persuasion, 1817. This is a quote that comes from the scene in chapter 5 where Anne has just gotten to her younger sister Mary's house, and Mary has berated her for being late, and Anne has to explain that she was getting her older sister Elizabeth's flowers in order, and you don't mess with Elizabeth's flowers. Elizabeth Elliot claims to be a great gardener, but one wonders how much actual gardening she does, how much dirt she gets under her fingers, as opposed to how much directing of the gardener she would do. Persuasion also has a lot of talk about bringing the garden indoors with plants, potted flowers, and cut flowers. And that's something to keep in mind if you don't have a big plot of land, or you live in an apartment and you don't have any land. You can still create an Austenesque scene using potted flowers. And lastly, we have Northanger Abbey. And here's a quote between Catherine and Henry. Henry is, as usual, joshing with Catherine. But now you love hyacinths, so much the better. You have gained new source of enjoyment. It is well to have as many holds upon happiness as possible. Austen masterfully uses her knowledge of gardens to let the reader know how very wealthy General Tilney is. She describes his kitchen gardens as a village of hothouses, a whole parish at work within the enclosure. Contemporary readers would have understood the value of this and status of a hothouse, an orangery, or in this case, a pinery. And a pinery is like a orangery or a hothouse, but it's for pineapples. And the general's offhand remark about how his estate only produces 100 pineapples shows just how nonchalant he is about money. In reality, a single pineapple was worth a small fortune, around 80 pounds. Jane Austen's readers would have understood not only how posh a pineapple was, but that to produce only 100 in a year indicates how great General Tilney's wealth was. Large estates like Northanger Abbey or Pemberley would have had over 100 gardeners employed full-time, year-round, with seasonal staff in spring, summer, or fall. And that's from Molly Williams' Jane Austen's Garden. So we've learned about flowers in the books and flowers that she grew up with. Now we're going to look at flowers that she loved. I want to caution you to check with your nursery and your nursery expert to make sure that any flowers that you're going to plant are appropriate and non-invasive for your area. All these flowers should be good for the mid-Atlantic, and they should work zones 5 to 7. But again, check with your garden expert. So we're going to go through a bunch of flowers that were talked about either in the books, in the letters, or that grew at Chaunton or Steventon, or just I know grew in the Regency era. So the first one is columbine. Columbine grows 12 inches high. It has lovely blooms, which are 2 to 3 inches wide. You want to plant it 18 to 24 inches apart. It blooms in spring and summer and will rebloom in the fall. It likes full sun to part sun. It is deer resistant. Columbine signifies folly, and the primary source for this is the letters. So I know I'm giving you a lot of information. We're going to have a chart later on that you can take a screenshot of, so you don't have to write all this down. The next flower is the anemone. This is so beautiful. The height of this plant is 20 to 24 inches. The blooms are a delicate 1 to 1.5 inch. You plant it 12 to 16 inches apart. It blooms early to midsummer. It likes full sun to part sun. It resists deer and attracts bees. The catalog that I found this in describes it as a versatile perennial with a demure charm. This windflower variety creates enchanting drifts of bowl-shaped blooms that dance above the finely cut foliage. And I felt like Jane Austen could have written that description. I loved it. We know about this from the primary documentation from Steventon. They grew these in Steventon. We also know from the letters. Next, we go from the very delicate anemone to the very old hollyhock. This is a monster. It grows 4 to 7 feet tall. You plant them 1 foot to 2 feet apart. The blooms themselves are 3 to 5 inches. It blooms late to midsummer, and it likes full sun. Again, it's deer resistant and attracts bees and pollinators. Because of the height and fragrance of the hollyhock, this is a good screen flower, and they were often used to obscure the privy because, of course, the privy was not inside the house, it was out in the garden, and they needed to hide it in some way. So if you have a privy in your garden, this is a good flower to use. There's no primary source, but hollyhocks were popular flowers during the Regency period, and I believe they are currently grown at Chawton Cottage. Next, we have Sweet William. Sweet Williams are delicate. They grow to 14 to 18 inches. The flowers themselves are tiny, but they grow in clusters of 3 to 5 inches. They like full sun to part shade. You want to plant them 12 to 15 inches apart. Be sure to deadhead the blooms and you will have lots of flowers. They're deer resistant and they're bee and pollinator friendly. These are also good for containers. So if you're growing a container garden, this is a good choice. Sweet William signifies gallantry, and the primary source is the letters. Next is my favorite flower, lavender. This is English lavender, and it grows 12 to 16 inches. The seeds are teeny tiny, so I don't even have a description of how big the seed heads are. It likes full sun, and let's see. Lavender plants attract pollinators and are deer and drought resistant. It signifies distrust, and the primary source is the letters. And we have these beautiful pansies. These pansies grow 8 inches tall, and they are deer resistant and pollinator friendly. You can plant these in containers. They signify thoughtfulness. The source is that they were commonly grown in Regency gardens, and I think they are currently grown at Chawton. Daisies. According to this source, they can grow up to 12 inches to 36 inches. I've never seen a daisy grow 36 inches, but according to this grower, it does. You want to plant them every 12 to 18 inches. The heads are 2.5 to 3 inches. They bloom from spring to early summer. They make excellent cut flowers. They attract pollinators and they are deer resistant, but they are toxic to pets. They were common in Regency gardens and they signify innocence. Morning glories. Morning glories are another one if you need something big. The vines grow up to 15 feet. Their blooms are 4 inches wide. And they like full sun. Morning glories attract pollinators and they are also deer resistant. Morning glories signify affection, and the source is Regency era, common in the Regency era, and I think they grow at Chawton now. Marigolds. These are bonanza marigolds. They grow 8 inches tall. They have 2-inch blooms. They like full sun. They repel deer and other pests, including like insects. but they attract butterflies. Marigolds signify sorrow. They were common in Regency era gardens. Hyacinth. They grow up to 8 to 10 inches tall. You want to plant them 5 to 6 inches apart. They like full sun. They are very fragrant. They deter pests in the garden, including deer, and they attract bees. This is Mansfield Park, and they were grown at Steventon. Hyacinths were highly valued for their blooms and intense fragrance. If you plant, you can bring these inside because you can use these as cut flowers, but I warn you, if you use them as cut flowers, people will know you have them in the house. They are very fragrant. The meaning, depending on the color, could be jealousy, desire for forgiveness, joy, or sincerity. Mignonette. I had never heard of this flower until I started doing research for this program, and I'm so glad I did because I'm fallen in love and I want to grow these. These have mini blooms that's very similar to lavender, with the mini blooms glowing up the stem. They grow 1.5 to 2 feet high, and you want to space them 8 inches apart. They bloom all summer and into fall. A mignonette has an ambrosial scent that includes overtones of violet and raspberry that attracts all the honeybees in the vicinity, according to the seed catalog. They symbolize charm, or that your qualities surpass your charm. In other words, if you were not the most handsome girl at the ball, but you had a lot of charm, you might be given a mignonette. The source is the letters. And now we come to roses, and there's a quote from Northanger Abbey again. We've got Henry talking to Catherine. And of course, poor Fanny had to pick those roses out in the heat. There was an English grower in 2017 for the 200th anniversary of Jane Austen's death, who developed the Jane Austen rose, which is the orange rose that you see on the left-hand side there. It's a moderately fragrant orange rose with double blooms and a glossy dark foliage. That same grower, Harkness and Company, developed a series of other roses, including the Pride and Prejudice rose, a lovely white bloomer, and that was introduced in 2013, the anniversary of Pride and Prejudice. The Mansfield Park rose, a smaller bloom with tight petal formation that comes in several colors, and is popular among florists. And the Emma Woodhouse rose, a cupped rose with 3 to 4 inch blooms that blushes either pink in cooler temperatures or apricot in warmer temperatures. And that all sounds super lovely, except that Harkness and Company will not deliver to the US. I called and asked. They do not deliver, they do not ship here, and there's no way to get those. But I have a solution, and that is the Notting Hill rose. The Notting Hill rose comes from Grace Rose Company, and they deliver to Maryland. So I'm sure they would deliver to Virginia as well. It is also a cupped rose. It's slightly pinker than the Emma Woodhouse rose, but I think it has a lot of the same qualities. And I just think it's a gorgeous rose. And last of our flowers we're going to look at is the primrose. This is the wild primrose. It's a perennial. It's 8 to 10 inches tall. You space it 10 to 12 inches apart, and it has lovely 1 to 2 inch blooms. This one wants partial shade to full shade. So if you've got a lot of shade in your garden, this is a nice one. It blooms in the spring. It's not deer resistant, but it is pollinator friendly. And the primary source is Steventon. It signifies young love or deep love. So I promised you a chart that you could look at. This is the first part of the chart. So if you want to take a screenshot of this, it could help you plan your garden. So we're going to pause for a few seconds so you can take a screenshot. I know it's a lot of information. And you can think about what your favorite flower might be, or series of flowers. And hopefully that's enough time, because I'm going to now switch and we're going to see the second part of that chart. Now we go from daisy down to primrose. And here's that Mingo net. I'm probably saying it wrong, but I love it so much. And now I think that probably gives you enough time to take a screenshot of that. So we're going to go on to the next section of the talk, which is creating an Austenesque garden. So the first thing you want to consider when creating your Austenesque garden or any garden is what existing features you have to work with, how much space you have, what your general budget is, how much time you want to dedicate to making and maintaining your garden, and how much sunlight each area of your garden is going to get, and what your water source is, because you don't want to be, as romantic as it sounds, to like carry a pitcher of water, a water jug down. It's not. You want to have easy access with a hose. So a Regency garden was all about balance. And this is a photo that I took from Silburn Arboretum in Baltimore. And it looks like I took it and put it into Photoshop and then flipped it and got a wider view. But really, it's just one photograph that I took on my iPhone and used the panorama function. If you ever come up to Baltimore and you want a really cool garden place to go see, go to Silburn. It's a hidden gem. It's very near Pimlico Race Course, so it's in the city and it's a real hidden gem. They have lots of lovely garden spots there. Okay, so here we see how straight ahead and then straight out, everything is completely balanced. The next thing you want to do is frame your garden. So this photo comes from Williamsburg. It's a backyard garden. Use a hedge, wall, or pergola to frame your garden. Adorn the walls and gates of the pergola with climbing flowers and plants like wisteria or morning glory. This one is laid to lawn with flowers lining the picket fence, which is kind of hard to see because this foliage is getting in the way, but flowers are lining each side of the fence. There are shrub accents, and this symmetrical garden benefits from this cool and private foliage in the back with a covered walkway. There's a peekaboo rake in the walkway, which lets you see the house, and more importantly, lets Mama, who's in the house, see you, so you don't get into any trouble. You want to create a focal point. We know that the Austens had a sundial in their garden at Steventon, so I found a picture of the sundial at the Sundial Garden in Winterthur. A sundial can be very expensive, so it doesn't have to be a sundial, but you want a destination feature, an eye catcher, at the center of the garden or at the end of a walk. This could be a bench, a fountain, an ornamental sculpture. It could be a sundial, or it could be a topiary. The Austens had a sundial at Steventon, and depending on the size of your garden, your focal point could include a sculpture, a fountain, a bird bath, or even a gazebo or a folly. So now I wanted to talk about gravel paths versus mulch. And here's a quote from Molly Williams. Straying from the gravel path by the shrubbery signified a disturbance in character and plot. And we definitely saw that with Marianne going off the gravel path into danger in Sense and Sensibility. Regency gardeners used gravel to line their paths. They could have also used a number of things like brick or shells or stone. But gravel was the best because it drained away the rain and helped to keep the ladies' feet dry, because wet feet in the Regency era was like one step away from death. While the paths were sometimes crafted from different materials, gravel stood out as a favorite option due to its low maintenance. Gravel walks required no regular watering, no mowing, no weeding, and offered us up an easy upkeep with a simple rake. And that's from Molly Williams again. Gravel cost, so I thought, okay, but how much is gravel going to cost? And so I looked into it, and gravel costs about twice as much as mulch costs, but it also lasts a lot longer because mulch needs to be replaced every few years. Gravel stabilizes the ground, prevents erosion, and gravel pathways require minimum upkeep because unlike mulch, which regularly needs to be replaced and there's a lot of weed upkeep, gravel is stable. Regardless of which material you choose, you have to prepare your path. So you have to mark out your path by using string and some post. And you need nice straight lines because we're going for a Regency garden. If you want nice curved lines, that's fine. You're just not going to get a Regency garden. You're going to get a modern garden. So you're going to do nice straight lines and you're going to dig out the grass. If you're going to do mulch, you only have to dig down a couple of inches and then you lay out landscape fabric and you put down your mulch. If you're doing a gravel path, you want to dig down 6 inches. You fill the bottom with loose stones and then pea gravel, and then you tamp all that down. You cover it with the landscape fabric. You fill in a layer of sand, and then you cover that with the gravel. So you can see where the expense gets to be twice as much. Don't forget a place to sit and enjoy. So I give credit to my husband, Bill, for this picture from Williamsburg. And it's a lovely white fence. Lovely white bench. A garden bench or two is always a welcome place to stay and enjoy both the sun and your hard work. Benches are a great destination at the end of a long path, and you can go formal like this bench, or you can just turn a log on its end and sit there. Have that to sit in. You want to mix your height and your color. This again is from Silver Arboretum, and you can see that we've got tall plants in the back and smaller plants in the front because you wouldn't want to do it the other way or you wouldn't be able to see your small plants. They also do a great job of matching colors and offsetting colors. And also you want to plant for many seasons. We are so lucky that the lady that owned the house before us planted for all seasons, so I have color well into fall. So now I'm going to take you through how I would design my fantasy garden in part of our backyard. The first thing I did was take a photograph of the part of the backyard I want to do our fantasy garden in. I took a panorama of the existing area, which includes my husband's woodworking shop, which has a covered area for the lawn items, and then the woodwork shop itself. That's over here. And then over here, we have a little gardening shed. We've got a ramp that goes down here. We've got a ramp that goes down over here. Next, we have, so you can do a basic outline of what you need to use, of what you want to do in your garden. You can use an expensive gardening app. I tried that, but it was going to take me so much time to learn the gardening app, and also it cost money. I said, I'm just going to pull out this grid paper and do it this way. So Sharpie and grid paper was a lot less expensive. And I figured out about how big everything was. I know we have a gate to the field here, and I knew that that would be a nice straight entrance for me to do a nice even garden. I marked off everything that I needed to put in there, and each square is about 6 inches. So start with your fixed items, like buildings. And then fill in the things that you know you're not going to move. And for us, we have hydrangeas on this side, and there was no way I was going to pull out my hydrangeas. So when I was doing this talk, I was like, I really want to keep my hydrangeas, but are they Regency? And I went down a rabbit hole and I found out that King George III grew hydrangeas at Kew Castle, or Kew, I think it's a castle. And so I felt very justified in keeping my hydrangeas. And then I just sketched out where I wanted the rest of the garden to be planted. So if this is going to be my center part of the garden, I can do a nice big bed here. I can have a little bed here because I have to have room for the ramp for the things to come in and out of the garden shed. But I can mirror it roughly here and then also have a little extra over here and have a little bed over here. I can plant things along here, and we've got some room here and here that I can plant. Then I used colored pencils and markers to map out what plant I wanted to go where. this is the fun part. So I've got morning glory, climbing up those posts that hold up this shed roof. I've got hollyhocks where I can have really nice tall things. I've got sweet William where there's a little bit of shade. I've got some more morning glory over here. Here's where I've got the very mirrored section with lavender, lavender, pansy, pansy, mignonette, mignonette, daisy, daisy. And then as you walk in, this is all very mirrored as well. I've got a central focal point with a sundial, if I could afford it. And then I have the roses sort of offsetting each other. And I'd be very happy if I could have a garden that looked like that. It would be a lot of work, but I would like it. And then in here, I would just either mulch or I would have gravel. You're almost done. But the last thing that no garden can do without, no garden is complete without your cat telling you whether you did a good job. And here's Mochi telling us that we did a good job. So I will now open it up to questions.
Thanks so much, Rita. If you have any questions, please type them in the chat box or raise your hand and I can unmute your microphone.
So one thing I wanted to do was share this page that has some links to Jasna. If you want, perhaps if you wanted to go to that Jane Austen AGM, the annual general meeting that we talked about at the very beginning, you do have to be a member of Jasna, but there are lots of things you can do with Jasna. You don't have to, sometimes you don't have to be a member. You can just join us as a guest. But here's Jasna on the Jasna right here is the one to join Jasna, and then you can join us at Maryland. You can join us at DC. You can contact them in VA and Virginia, Central Virginia. And then this is the Manor Mill website if you're interested in anything there. Any questions?
I love the idea of having a Jane Austen garden.
It
doesn't seem that difficult.
I think
you kept it pretty simple.
Oh, I know what I wanted to tell you was we went to Giant. I don't know if you guys have giant food stores down there.
We do.
Right in the produce aisle today, I found seeds for columbine and seeds for lavender, and I was like, "Ooh, I'm gonna get started."
So you're going to plant from seeds. You're not going to do little plants.
You can plant from seeds. You can go to the gardening center and get flowers.
Will you come back and show us when it's done and growing?
No, because I don't know if it'll work. Well.
Anybody else going to try a Jane Austen garden? I think I'd start much smaller than you're doing. I wish all those flowers worked in a container because I really like the idea of doing a couple of Jane Austen containers. If you could find other authors who had gardens, you could do a whole literary.
That would be so cool.
Container gardening.
I absolutely love that.
Yeah,
well, most of them say that you can grow them in containers.
Oh, okay. I might try that this year then.
Sure. I'm looking at the chart and most of them say you can grow them in containers, but some of them would be pretty wild and woolly in a container. I think they grow pretty big.
It'd be cool if you could do some sort of reference to Jane Austen. I know the flowers are a reference to her, but something else in the garden, you know. You couldn't do a page from a book or anything.
I always think of her as wearing blue, so that would be a nice like tribute to have some like light blues.
Oh yeah,
which would give it the lavender.
Yes.
And then you could think about like which books were referenced.
Oh, I know. Maybe you could do like quotes of hers on rocks.
Oh, I love that idea.
Right?
Yeah.
Says I want to do a modern garden with the Jane Austen flowers. Oh, I love that.
That's a great idea.
Yeah.
And you could take if you had a bench, you could write a quote on the bench. I know that
Oh, a bench is a good idea. Yeah.
you were worried about going away and like not having anybody water your garden or having to start your garden late because you were going away
Mm.
earlier in the season. And I know that we started Cosmos and what was the other one? Maybe my husband will chime in and tell us. Zinnias pretty late last year, and they still grew, and they grew like well into October, maybe
I've heard
November.
that about zinnias. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's a
and
good
they were
idea.
fantastic.
Someone's asking, do you know if all the flowers can grow in zone 7, which is here?
Let me
You,
tell you, that is an excellent question, and
I think
it
you're
looks
zone
like
7 as
all the
well.
ones- yeah, all the ones that we talked about today grow in zone 7.
Oh, great.
Thank you for asking. That's a really good question.
Yeah.
The one that had the biggest range, one had a crazy big range, was I think the marigold was 3 to 10, which was a really big range.
Mm, but they're not annuals. I mean, they're not perennials.
I didn't mark off which ones were annuals and which ones were
Okay.
perennials, but I know some of them are perennials, and a
Here's the-
lot of them are self-seeders too.
Yeah,
So,
that's true.
I
But
know
they're,
that. Go
yeah,
ahead.
you can find marigolds everywhere. That's not a big thing to have to plant those every year. They're not like an expensive flower or
But they're so hardworking. They're a good hardworking
they're
flower.
really pretty and they just remind you of summer, you know? I think most people feel like they've known marigolds forever, right?
Yeah.
Moms planted them and
So I would say hollyhocks are probably the most difficult flower to grow because those are biannual, which means you're going to grow it, and the first year you're not going to see anything, and then the second year you're going to see it.
yeah,
So you have to like grow them and then plant some more the next year and then grow them, and you know
right,
you have to
right.
keep going with
So
those.
you always, yeah.
But those give you such a big bang for your buck.
Oh, they're beautiful.
Yeah.
Any other questions or comments,
And
ideas?
of course hollyhocks you can shade cover up your privy, so that's always very important too.
Yeah. Thank you. I know you did so much research for this. We really
Oh, so
appreciate
fun.
it. And good luck with your annual meeting. Maybe
Thanks.
maybe you'll see me there.
Oh, I hope so. I hope so. It's a really fun meeting, and it's great. We were talking beforehand how people come to it. People come to Austen at different places in their lives. Some people come and they just want to dress up in Regency gear. You don't have to dress up in Regency gear to be in the Jane Austen Society, but some people really like it. And some people come because they want to be very scholarly and they want to read the books, and that's fine. And some people come because they like the movies, and that's fine. You come to Austen where you are, and that's what I like about the AGMs, the annual general meeting, is you have people from all sorts of backgrounds for Austen. It's really neat.